Title of this was Five Cranky Women, because I was interested in anger and the role that anger plays actually in theological exposition in a way, and the particular role it plays in the work of some of these women. Hence, Five Cranky Women. His owners asked me for a more dignified title at some point, so I came up with this one. But every time I look at it, it reminds me of the Almodovar film Woman on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. So I'm not sure this is better, really, but anyway. A few people have been confused, I think, in the lead-up to Conclave, because a lot of people imagine that I'm talking about feminist theology in some sense, and I'm not. None of these women are really within the feminist theology continuum, so I'm not talking about a theology of women in any sense. I don't think there's anything particularly inappropriate about a man doing a presentation on the theology of women necessarily, but I'm not. I have a couple of, can you say impeti? I don't know. Impetuses for the talk. One is that about a year ago I was reflecting on what I'd been reading recently, and you know, my theological reading is extremely unthorough and non-rigorous, and it's led largely by what I think looks cool at the time. And I was reflecting on it, and it occurred to me that really all the interesting theology that I've been reading over the last 3 or 4 years has all been women. That's the stuff that really gets my attention. And it's not because I'm going looking for women, it's just that I'm looking for interesting theology, and most of it seems to be coming from women, insofar as I can see. So I was interested in kind of bringing some of that into, I think of Conclave as an opportunity to engage in a process of continuous discourse upgrade within the church, so that we're all improving the language that we can use to talk about things, and that goes on year after year. So I wanted to introduce some of this to the annual discourse upgrade for the church. So that's one part of it. The other part of it, other than just sort of pointing out that there's a lot of women doing interesting work in theological innovation at the moment. And the other thing is just to reflect a little bit on this question of anger. Several times I've shared some stuff that some of these women have written in various forms amongst other clergy, and it's not uncommon to get a response, because back from some of these things that His Grace actually said at some point, I couldn't really understand what she was saying through the anger. And that's quite a common response. It's quite difficult to read someone when the way they're expressing things is very annoyed, or even to the point of rage. Right? It's a constitutionally difficult thing to do. The thing is, I think that by adopting that stance, you shut yourself out from the possibility of hearing something that's potentially very interesting, because rage takes various different forms. And not all, we're used to reacting to rage as though it's an attack or an affront of some kind, but rage arises for various reasons and it has various meanings, and I think it's interesting to kind of sit with rage. And there's a bunch of reasons I'll talk about that, but I'll do that right at the end. So what I'm going to try and do, I just realised you can't see that slide, that's me looking at my presenter's view. Okay, cool. So here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So I've talked about 2 of these women already. If you were at the Conclave in Wisconsin, I already talked about Cynthia Bourgeault for a while. Actually, I did a fairly long presentation on her, and that's been up on YouTube for a bit, so you may have already seen it. Last year in Sydney, I talked about the ecclesiology of Mary Collo, who writes particularly about the symbols, the 2 major deep symbols in the 4th Gospel, the symbol of the temple and the symbol of the household, and the role that might play in a Johannite ecclesiology. So I'm going to review them just very briefly, just to kind of touch in, because this whole thing kind of connects together in a very sort of non-linear, kind of unclear, which is a way of saying I haven't really sorted it out yet and I'm hoping you'll help me kind of a way, right? So in a very real way, I'm really giving an ad for the thought of these 5 women. I can't hope to really get very deep into this in the time that I've got available, or the amount of scholarship that I've done for that matter. So I'm also going to talk about Maggie Ross, Bernadette Roberts, and Margaret Barker. For the 3 I'm going to really lean in on a bit today. So hopefully by the end there'll be some kind of hyperspatial shape evident, and maybe some of you can help me understand it, perhaps over dinner or conversation tomorrow or whatever, we can continue talking about it. But I also just want to provide enough detail on the writing of these 5 women that you might be inspired maybe to pick up one of them and explore it a bit for yourself, and then hopefully it'll do me the favour of coming back to me in 6 months or a year's time and going, okay, right, I've read Barker, I think she's an idiot, and here's why, you know, and we can talk about it a bit. The last little thing I want to talk about is just some of this sort of reflection on I'm calling it power, periphery, and rage. So what rage in this sense is about, and why I think it's important to listen through it. Okay, so let's head on in. No questions on the overview, right? Everyone's good?
So when you say this, you're specifically treating rage, literary rage, I think it.
Rather than someone standing in front of you hoping to punch you in the nose, you mean?
Yeah.
Is that that's the distinction you're interested in? Yeah, I'm talking about literary rage. I'm talking about someone who writes from where the words on the page kind of seethe. So I mean that in the sense of, in some cases that's about adopting a rhetorical stance of polemic, which is quite common. Sometimes it's about adopting a discourse of very strong critique with respect to institutions or with respect to a mainstream discourse. Sometimes it's just crankiness. Maggie Ross is just cranky all the time. It's hard to really pigeonhole it exactly. She's just ubiquitously cranky. So we'll get into that. All right, so to start with, this is my favourite Cynthia the Pixie picture that I always like to use. Who wasn't in Wisconsin? So I guess Jonathan, Ben, Maggie. Okay, you guys were. Rebecca wasn't. Yeah. But you know a bit about Cynthia already, right? Cynthia's written 5 or 6 books, I guess now. Her big. So she's an Episcopalian priest, Anglican priest, I'd say. She was one of the first generation of Anglican women priests in the United States. She's one of the foremost teachers of centering prayer. She's really famous for a book called Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening. It's probably one of her key things, which is one of the clearest expositions of centering prayer in terms of what it's like to be inside the practice of centering prayer, as opposed to a lot of the other expositions of centering prayer, which are about how centering prayer makes sense in terms of Christian contemplative history, right? So it's a really helpful text. Her other famous book that I think she's really noted for is Wisdom Jesus, and Wisdom Jesus leans on a sequence of key themes. She talks quite a lot about the notion of kenosis and what that can mean in terms of Christian contemplative thought, so the emptying out of the self, the kind of clarification of the human soul, so that it becomes translucent to the light of God. She talks about how that results in the kind of abundance that's so richly evident in the parables of Jesus. She talks about the notion of singleness, or in Syriac hidayah, monogenes in Greek, and she talks about, okay, so that's often, that concept shows up in both the concepts of being the only begotten, but it also shows up in the concept of virgin, being virginal. And that's taken a very kind of concrete meaning in a lot of Christian tradition. She's looking at it in terms of its contemplative meaning, of being single-hearted, being pure of heart. And a lot of her writing in Wisdom Jesus in particular relates those 3 concepts to each other. That kenosis results in singleness, and singleness bears its fruits in abundance. And a sense of the world being abundant. There's a constant flow of abundance that we're participating in. I mean, this shows up in the words of our liturgy in the end of the intercessions, the quote about the birds of the air, do not sow nor reap nor store away in barns. This is what Jesus is trying to articulate. One of her other key themes, particularly in Wisdom Jesus, is the notion of Jesus as a wisdom teacher. So whatever other roles he plays in tradition, that he's a teacher who delivers, so she uses the Aramaic word for parables, mashlim. They're stories designed to, in her charming way of putting it, designed to fry your sockets. They're like, okay, so she makes an analogy to Zen koan. They're not Zen koans, obviously, it's quite a different function, but they've got quite an extremely different structure. But they share a common thing, that they're texts designed to not convey things to you in an epistemic way. They're texts that are designed to kind of do something to your head in a particular way with the hope of snapping your mind out of its traditional way of seeing things. And in some sense, the parables, like a koan, are something that you can only really understand from a transformed consciousness. They make a certain kind of moral sense, well, most of them do, and then you run into the things like the landowner who takes on some workers at, dawn, and then some workers at, the 3rd hour, and some at the 5th hour, and some at the 9th hour, and they all show up at the end of the day, and he pays all of them the same rate. If you work in union politics, this is a terrible parable, right? It's not helpful at all. And it doesn't seem to be very moral. It seems very unfair, because the landowner says, it's my money, I'll do what I want, basically. You kind of go, this is a hard teaching, who can accept it, right? It notably doesn't show up in the lectionary, for a standard lectionary, because it's a devil of a thing to try and do a sermon around and try and make it make sense to people from a regular frame of mind. It makes sense from the frame of mind of kenosis, from singleness, because it's helping to convey a world in which there's endless abundance. And so this kind of grasping, the action of the grasping mind to say, this isn't fair, I want more, is an incorrect way of seeing the situation. But from the one frame, it's not really possible to see it, and from the other frame, it's obvious. So that's a similarity to the way koans work as well. So broadly, she's an advocate she's pitching Jesus as an advocate for a non-dual consciousness, and for metanoia being a way of sort of signalling a shift to a completely different frame of mind, which is sort of uncontroversial for Gnostics, I think. Meta means transcendent or above, and noia, mind. So it gets translated as repentance into English. So when John the Baptist says repent, he's saying metanoia. And that's usually in mainstream Christianity for the last few centuries, in the West in particular, that's been understood as meaning, straighten up and fly right, stop sinning. Certainly that's what it means in evangelical Christianity. It's not really understood that way, I've got to say, in Orthodox Christianity in the East, and just by looking at the word, it really doesn't mean that. It means shift to a different level of mind or a different level of understanding. Your Eminence, are you frowning because you're sleepy or because you disagree?
Both, but I'm also thinking.
Okay.
I don't necessarily disagree. I would add things to it, going along the lines of transform your thoughts, and or transform the things that thinks them. But in relation to, I was just thinking in relation to the parable, it's that it's not too late to transform. You don't get less if you're slow.
Different interpretation. Yeah. Yeah. So sorry, I'm being a bit slack in using "this is what it is" language, and I really mean this is what Cynthia's saying language.
Yeah.
Okay. So I can't defend all of these women either, right? So you may passionately disagree with what they're saying, and I'll give it a go at clarifying it so that it makes more sense. But this is their thought. So that's Cynthia Bourgeault. The other big thing, I think, the big gift she gives is a really rich and passionate description of the sort of traditional Benedictine methods for pulling this off. The first half of Wisdom Jesus is an analysis of the parables from this perspective, and the second half of Wisdom Jesus is going through psalm chanting, the Eucharist, Lectio Divina, centering prayer as practice methods that cultivate this transformation of mind that metanoia describes, which is partly why you see me being as kind of continuously pushy about that particular system of method as I am. I get that from Cynthia, really, because she pitches well. It's good. You kind of buy that it works. And she explains why each of them, the role that each of those different pieces of the puzzle plays in the transformation of the human soul. So it's neat. Okay, so that's Cynthia Bourgeault. Any questions? Is it kind of enough? Kind of grokked it at some kind of level? Yeah, good? Okay, so Mary Collar, who is an Australian, lives in Melbourne. So one of the other characteristics of these women is that they're all older women. They're all women over 50 or so, and that's an interesting thing. Okay, so Mary has two books. One's called God Dwells With Us, and the other's called Dwelling in the Household of God. God Dwells With Us deals with, they both deal with symbols with a capital S. So she does an analysis of the fourth gospel in terms of the way that, in each book, the way one key symbol shows up as in the deep structure of the gospel. So the way in which the symbol organizes various events and various clues throughout the gospel and sort of undergirds the structure of the gospel. So it's not a simple symbol in the sense of a metaphor that gets reused a lot of times. It's something that sort of shows up in different ways. So the first symbol in God dwells with us is the symbol of the temple. The characteristics of the temple is that it's a personal, sensory, accessible manifestation of divinity. God shows up in the physical temple in classical times. It answers the question where wisdom lives, because traditionally wisdom would have lived in the temple. It shows up in Exodus as both the ark and the tent of meeting. So the question through a lot of the Pentateuch at least is, where does wisdom dwell? And to begin with, wisdom starts dwelling in the ark and the tent of meeting. And then with the conquest of Jerusalem, Solomon builds the temple, and wisdom comes to dwell in the Holy of Holies within the temple. So if you want to be close to God, the answer is go to Jerusalem and hang out near the temple, because that's where God is. Initially, you kind of hang out with the people, and God's in the tent over there when Moses wants to talk to him, and then ultimately God indwells the temple as the Shekinah, the presence of God in the temple. So, what does the Gospel of John tell us about the temple? Mostly that Jesus' role is to replace the temple. So he promises the replace of the temple as early as the first chapter. He overturns the temple with the scene with the money changers, Ed's favourite scene, which gets reduced to an eyebrow wiggle in the Leviticon, but it's still there. He appropriates the temple festivals through John chapter 7 to 10 in a series of scenes which recapitulate the year of festivals in the temple. And then he's anointed, I think, in the anointing scene as the great high priest. Finally, in the hour, the Passion at the foot of the cross, he is lifted up. John is the beloved disciple, is adopted into his family, becomes part of the physical structure of the new temple, and he gives over his spirit. So he's kind of replaced the temple with his person. So the answer through the course of the fourth gospel to how do I hang out with God, it becomes, instead of go to the temple, becomes hang out with Jesus. And he's the proximity of God in the midst of the disciples. It's a bit grim though, right? Because hang out with Jesus, oh, he's gone. What do we do now? So Mary's answer to why it's not as grim as you may think it is her second book, Dwelling in the Household of God, where she looks at the parallel development of the symbol of the household through the gospel, which runs side by side with the development of the temple symbol. So the other thing that's happening alongside the overturning of the temple is the creation of the household. And this shows up in various places. So John's not portrayed as a forerunner or a preparer of the way in the fourth gospel. He's portrayed as the bridegroom's friend. So he prepares the bride for her marriage to the bridegroom. There's a wedding. There's a new birth in his conversation with Nicodemus. There's a lot of talk about eternal life in the household. How do we characterize living in this household that we're talking about? Well, there's death involved. There's Christ as the head of the household, as the Lord. There's a foot washing, welcoming new members into the household. Gosh, these are all notes from last year and I haven't reviewed them properly. Anyway, we're all living with each other in the household, so there's lovely speeches about mutual indwelling. The non-geometrical character in the fourth gospel is talking about full and there's a lot of speeches about friendship. And so this all sort of comes to a head towards the end of the fourth gospel in the resurrection discourses, which I don't think is necessary for the argument. It's one of the pleasing things about this morning, is kind of recognising most of this stuff is brought to fruition within the Leviticon. You don't really need the resurrection discourses, but it continues kind of robustly through the resurrection discourses, all of which happen inside a house with the door shut. So it's the kind of household gathering together. I can't remember the Ballo thing at all. Never mind. Right, anyway. So the point is that through the course of the fourth gospel, Mary Kollow's core argument is that on the one track that's going through the gospel, the temple's being replaced by the person of Jesus. And at the same time, Jesus is simultaneously preparing a household as the new topos of God. So the gathering, the ecclesia of the disciples, not church necessarily, but the gathering together, that whenever two or more are gathered in my name, there I am, is gathered through the course of the gospel, explicated in these various stories about how a household ought to work. The role of the father with respect to the household as the loving loving, non-patriarchal, non-hierarchical leadership of faith, exemplified by the women in the household, who are all through the fourth gospel. And it depicts a kind of less of a sort of state temple cult and more of a sort of intimate household of friends, which is what comes through. I think, you know, if you've read John a couple of times, that's what really starts to catch you with it, is this sort of warm gathering together of friends. And it's a real depiction of an outpouring of love from God and of self-revelation. So God's interested in us because we are loved by God, and God's interested in God's self-revelation, rather than some kind of reparation for sin situation. It's not very Pauline. Sacredness of human relationship as, I don't know. It's off the end of the slide somewhere. The key thing, I think Mary's key thing, and the reason I was really, really delighted in her book, is she depicts the human relationship as the topos of the divine indwelling. So John, it's easy to pick up through John that God indwells each of us as individuals. But I think what's there in the symbol of the household is that God indwells the relationship between us. So there's a sacredness to human relationship, that when I speak with you and you speak with me and we are in communication with each other, that's a sacred thing. And that we have to mind that and be aware of that and hold that as sacred, you know. That those human relationships between two of us or between all of us as a community is a sacred topos of God. As sacred as the indwelling of God in myself. Ben?
Have you looked in on Martin Buber yet?
No. But the same I-thou relationship. I mean, I'm aware of it, but I never read it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's Mary Collar. So that's the talk I gave last year, and it's unrolling itself on YouTube as we speak, if you want to.
This is interesting because I'm just now going through some reading to teach myself about the debate within the last 10 or 15 years of religious studies, archaeology, theology, biblical history, and critique, and all that. Mm-hmm. And one of the big debates is temple religion, state religion / Yahwism versus household religion or folk religion, if you dare to use that term.
Right.
And how it's textual criticism versus archaeology.
Right.
It's pretty interesting.
It is.
I don't have enough to say on that because I haven't read enough about it, but it definitely reflects what's been going on the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Right.
In studies. That's really fascinating.
And look, it's a tension in all religion, and it's certainly a tension in Christianity between the household devotion and, you know, the city cathedral, right? And what goes on between those two things. There's another tension between the monastics in the desert and the cathedral. Sure. Right? But there's the householder, the bishop, and the monk.
Right.
If you like.
But at Jesus' time, I mean, the monks were not that far away.
True. Yeah.
And the earlier tension and what would have still stayed in history and would have still been part of even Jesus' time is, you know, most people didn't go to the temple. They never made it to the temple. Most people didn't leave the family household. They didn't leave the area they were born to. It just didn't happen.
Yep.
So they had no contact with the official state religion. And we see that by reading in between the lines, of course, in the Old Testament when they go stamping out the Asherahs and all the rest of that.
Right. So you're going to really enjoy the last part of the talk.
Fantastic.
That's all I have to say. Is there anything else anything you want to throw in? Or no? It's all good? Cool. All right. So that's really by way of review. I apparently can't spell patriarchal for some reason. I've just noticed after a year. Okay. So that's our first two figures, Mary Collar and Cynthia Bourgeault. And I commend both of their books to you. I really commend Wisdom Jesus for, if you're into centering prayer, then Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening is the best book to get started with the practice. And Wisdom Jesus is priceless. It's worth reading, whether you care or not, really, honestly. It's a great book. I think I read it, and I was SMSing His Eminence, I think, that week, or we were talking on IM or something. So Cynthia Bourgeault is a lost Johannite, I think I recall saying. Maybe we should invite her over, maybe that could work.
Well, we have Conclave with Melbourne.
Yeah, well, Mary Collar could certainly be a speaker. Well, I invited Mary Collar to speak at the Conclave last year, but she was leading a tour through the Holy Land, I think, at the time, so she had to respectfully decline. That may have been an excuse, because she's a Roman Catholic nun, but, you know, what the heck. She's been very generous. She had a chat to me on the phone, and we've corresponded by email a few times, so she's pretty warm. Okay, my third cranky woman, perhaps the crankiest of the cranky women, Maggie Ross is a pseudonym. Her real name is Martha Reeves. She's an anchorite under vows to the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's a photo from some time ago. I think she's in a... I hope she doesn't... Maggie, I'm sorry if you're watching this, but I'm going to say late 60s. I really don't know. I hope that's not insulting. Anyway. Maggie was a... She was a nun, she grew up in the United States. She was a nun for quite a while during the really difficult period to be a nun, so sort of late 50s through early 70s, I think, during all the changes in Vatican II. And when, you know, towards the late 50s, being a nun or a monastic of any kind in the Roman Catholic Church was a difficult time. It was tense, right? And she and a lot of her sisters bore the brunt of a lot of that tension, which I think was difficult. She left convent life and started to think and write quite a lot about solitary life. She's one of the most articulate monastic solitaries, I think, in the modern world. She's written a series of books, and she started to think quite a lot about what contemplative life was and what the life of solitariness was really about. So I became aware of her work with one key book, which is the third one, Pillars of Flame, Power, Priesthood and Spiritual Maturity, which a Baptist minister friend of mine in Auckland commended to me. She said, I really think you need to read Maggie Ross. I went, okay. There's like, I picked the book up and it's like, kind of sears your eyes out of your head. So the point of Pillars of Flame is really to say that the whole concept of apostolic succession is totally bankrupt at its core. And a priesthood that's based on it is insane, immoral, and destroying the church. I'm understating her point a little bit, right? I've sort of toned it down a little, just for out of deference to the audience. The only legitimate kind of priesthood is one which arises out of contemplative maturity. So I'd never read a book before. I was simultaneously kind of offended, enraged, inspired, made joyful, all at the same time, kind of almost by reading the same passages, because I kind of, no, yes, crazy. Okay, so Pillars of Flame is a good title, right? It really captures the spirit of the book. I've just finished the last book, which is a sequence of her essays, and I'm a passionate devotee of her blog. Maggie's way of expressing herself is very polemic, and to me it's largely because she spent quite a lot of her time in Christian institutional settings, and it's quite difficult to try and be a solitary contemplative and stay attached to a Christian institution, because in general, organisations don't like solitaries terribly much. They're awkward and difficult. Bishops are constantly sort of constructing regulations for how the life of solitaries ought to be conducted, and it's a very infuriating kind of process. Actually, one of the debts I owe to Maggie is I hadn't really grokked the vocation of a solitary as a distinct thing until I read Maggie's work, and particularly her blog, I guess. And it really helped me understand what the Order of St. Exclamond is about, which I realised I hadn't really got, because the point of the Order of St. Exclamond is it's an order of solitaries. It's for organising a whole group of solitaries. It's not a communal group at all. It's meant to be just a bunch of solitaries. And I hadn't really understood what that really meant until I read some of Maggie's work, because she depicts it so clearly. Her key themes are the centrality of contemplation as the core of Christian experience. That this is really from her point of view, the heart of it. From a more broad frame, that's debatable, but from the point of view of a contemplative solitary, contemplation is the core of Christian experience, which you could argue is a slightly self-serving observation, but supportable, right? And the source of spiritual legitimacy, which is what she's trying to get across in Pillars of Flame. Her key themes are silence, and particularly